Welcome to the Hermetic Astrology Podcast. I'm Gary Caton here in the New River Valley of Virginia, and you can find me on the web at dreamastrologer.com. I'm here today with a special guest, Ronnie Pontiac, to talk about the new book, Magic of the Orphic Hymns. Welcome to the show, Ronnie.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Right on. Yeah, I'm really happy too. I'm really especially happy that, probably at least half the book, by my estimation, consists of not the translations, but the history and the mythology and so forth. And that part was great. I've been reading through it the past couple mornings and just really enjoying that. So thank
Thank you.
you. Yeah. Yeah. And you were I always like to start with the beginning, which is people's origin story.
Okay.
So if you don't mind, can you tell us a little bit more about your experience with the hymns? You started out as a research assistant for Manly P. Hall, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. What was that like?
Oh, it was incredible.
Yeah.
Everything you would imagine it would be.
Right.
It
Right.
was 7 years of just amazing inspiration and education.
Right on. Right on. And in the process, he was working with the hymns, right? And that's how you started working.
Yeah. What happened, the last project I worked on with him, which occurred when he was already sending me away, because he had told me that he could see that his future horizon was limited, and that the people that ran the place, who for the most part were quite elderly, were all going to be checking out fairly soon, and he could perceive that there was going to be an ugly power struggle for the assets.
Mm.
So since I was a kid, and me and my wife were kids, and we were his friends, he said, "You need to get out of here and live your own life. I don't want you to have to experience what's going to happen here." And
Wow.
true enough, it was a terrible struggle that occurred after he passed.
That's
But
real
the
wisdom.
last thing we worked on was the Hymns of Orpheus. He was doing the reprint of the Thomas Taylor translation, the second edition.
Uh-huh.
And so I was immersed in them. I wasn't doing much. I was just doing the kind of stuff you do when you get ready to do a book, just light editing and working on blurbs for the cover kind of thing. But having the book in my hands and being able to go back and look at the original editions that he had, and then immersing myself in the history of it, even then, it was very moving. And especially since he had directed me to return to the world of music, which is where I had come from when I first met him.
Uh-huh.
And so this was a way of, we basically, my wife and I decided that we would do a kind of ritual to say goodbye to him and to the Philosophical Research Society, but also to say hello to our new lives. And so it started with me. I studied some ancient Greek. I went back to the original Greek with the help of the lexicon and the Little and Scott dictionary and the grammar. I was able to break down the sentences. And at the same time, she was acquiring every bit of information she could find about the cult aspects of each of the deities that are
This
addressed.
is Tamra. This is
Yes, Tamara.
Tamra
What are
Lewis,
the,
your
yes,
co-author and your wife,
exactly.
apparently.
Yes.
Okay.
And so she wanted to know everything about the correspondences and attributes associated with each, because our plan was to introduce some of those correspondences so that people would be able to get a better idea of the deity that's being addressed, because the hymns themselves, as you know, are very formulaic, very
Mm.
repetitive, and ultimately they're kind of boring, because the priests knew this information. When they addressed them, they didn't need all the details that we need to understand what the world that is governed by that particular deity, or the part of the world that's governed by that deity is. So
Right.
we first did that just for ourselves. We put it together, and then we softly sang it outside our apartment window, just looking out at apartment buildings and
I
a
love
few
this
trees.
story that you shared in the book about that experience, man. That's wild.
It was strange. We actually took on some of the Orphic prohibitions, so we weren't eating meat or beans, and we didn't have anything to do with drugs or alcohol. And We tried to do some form of purification, essentially. And
Hmm.
then we did each of them, trying to pay attention to what day we were doing and putting them into the calendar to match feast days for those deities if possible.
Hmm.
And some of the things that happened to us were dramatic in the way of synchronicities. And
Hmm.
so, for example, when we did the hymn to Athena, there in Hollywood, where especially back then there were no great horned owls, in broad daylight, a great horned owl lighted on the telephone pole that was nearest to us,
Wow.
and then it stayed there while we did the hymn. And then when we finished the hymn, this owl hopped off and swooped right at us in the window and then swooped straight up. And so we just looked at
Blessed
each
bright-eyed Athena. Wow, man.
yes.
Yeah.
And so we looked at each other and we thought, okay, well, let's see. I mean, we don't you don't want to just go nuts over one experience,
Yeah.
and we just thought, let's see, maybe this is just a happy serendipity that we got to enjoy. We try to keep it innocent, playful, and affectionate toward these deities.
Hmm.
And then we got more. So we got one, the Aphrodite one was sweet because while we were performing it, this couple walked by hand in hand underneath our window, and they stopped right underneath the window. And there's no way they could hear us because we're like whisper singing 3 stories up. And
Mm.
they stop underneath us and they kiss. So there was a couple kissing right when we did the Aphrodite
That's
hymn.
really interesting. If you don't mind, I'm gonna interrupt you just for a little
Please.
because you say you were, yeah, because I was wondering about that when I was reading your account. I was like, well, like it seemed as if your reading was not intrusive to their reality, and so I was wondering myself, like, how is that? So you were so because I've often thought like you can sing even like in your head, right? You can recite these things in your head. And I've often wondered, like, is one more effective than the other? And what I'm getting intuitively from hearing you saying, if you're whisper singing and it had the same kind of effect, I'm guessing like whether you're shouting it to the hills or whether you're whispering quietly, like if you have roommates or whatever, if somebody's sleeping in the other room or somebody's on the street below and you don't want to seem like you're insane or something.
Exactly.
It's the same effect, apparently. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to finding out how these things work for people. I've gotten some reports back. Before we published it, we gave them to some friends of ours who practice on the pagan witchcraft side, and also to friends who are theurgists
Uh-huh.
who practice a more strict Neoplatonic kind of thing.
Right.
And they came back with very positive reports. But
Mm.
I'm looking for, like, one person asked me, can these be used for manifesting stuff? And I thought, well, I don't think so, because I mean, really they're about tuning to the divine. But
Yeah.
if somebody tries it and it works, please let me know. I'm curious. So I
Yeah.
hope they go out there and they come back with information that we can all share, because Tamara and I didn't try to fix what was happening down to a definition.
Yeah.
We had enough of it happen. And I'll tell you one more story that is also in the book
Yes,
that was
please.
dramatic, which was at the end when we were actually giving the final draft to the publisher. We have this ritual kind of where we read them, anything we write, out loud before it goes in, because when you read something out loud, you get more of an understanding of what is actually in the words.
Hmm.
And so we read the whole thing. We read the hymns one after the other. We weren't singing them, though. This was just a respectful editorial read. Now, we had had a neighbor who had lived in this canyon all her life for decades. And she was a teenager in the 1960s. And she told us stories about when this area, our house and the other houses around here, weren't here. There were only a handful of houses and just a lot of dirt and weeds. And she said that the kids that grew up in this canyon, they had a trail that they could take all the way down to Sunset Boulevard, that they could go to the Whiskey, for example, coming down out of the hills and see like Jimi Hendrix play. Apparently they did. And they had something or a thing they did where they would bring a jug of wine and they would bring whatever poetry they'd been working on. and they would sit under this particular palm tree along the trail, and they would drink the wine and they would read poems to each other, and they called themselves the Dionysus Society.
Nice.
Now, when we finished the read, this was in the middle of COVID lockdown, and we did the last hymn, the hymn to death, and this screaming erupted in the canyon. There was screaming laughter and just like these shrieks that were so Dionysian, and so like it lifted, like it made your hair stand up, because at first you thought, my God, is someone being murdered? But then you
Right.
could tell that this was kind of an ecstasy going on. And
Wow.
so we rush outside, and where is it coming from? Where she pointed at and said that that's where the Dionysus Society met.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I love your conclusions. I mean, I'm reading here from page 3, so hopefully I'm giving, an accurate account, but yeah, I'll just read exactly your words. We didn't know what to make of it. We didn't believe that we were creating the phenomena. It felt more like being pulled into harmony with a series of improbable events. We felt more like witnesses than active agents. And I thought that, wow, that's really cool because, yeah, I've had the same thoughts before, like, whoa, like what's going on here? Especially when you encounter like weather phenomenon and stuff,
Yeah.
because the thought that you're creating that becomes obviously ridiculous to
Yeah.
anyone with any fair amount of sanity.
Mhm.
And yet there's something clearly going on, right? And so I
Yeah,
love
it's
the way,
fascinating.
yeah, I love the way you say that you were becoming tuned to it, right? So that there's this musical tuning, right? And there's all kinds of various tunings that as musicians we know, like many various tunings that people can use to achieve different effects. And so basically we can use these hymns as ways to tune ourselves to the various, you know, radio stations or chain of correspondences, ladder of being, whatever you want to call it, right? I really like that idea that we're tuning ourselves.
Yeah, I think the hymns are almost like a 360-degree um, ritual of appreciation and respect for the divine wisdom within life.
Mm,
And it covers almost every angle of life.
yeah,
You encounter everything in the hymns, and
yeah.
even death is approached respectfully with an understanding that there's divine wisdom there. So
Mhm.
we do say in that hymn, there's no way we get out of it. This is fate decrees necessity, and death will do that. And there's no asking mercy in the hymn.
Right.
The hymn is asking death to do what it does, that is the best of what it does, which is, one, teach us to love life,
Yes.
because what we cherish is not going to be here forever.
Right.
And it also, as it says in the hymn, it asks to be freed from the wheel of deep grief,
Hmm.
the wheel of reincarnation, or the cycles of being in a body, whatever you want to call it. And this is, the hope that this death, that this time we're liberated, and we drink from the water of memory. We remember the Orphic formula, and we say to the guardians, I'm a child of earth and of starry heaven, but my race is of heaven. And I'm thirsty. Give me to drink from the waters of memory. And then we're free from the wheel.
Yeah.
So even the death hymn has this profound divine wisdom in it. And then as far as the synchronicities too, if your listeners don't know about this one, this is much better than any of the ones that Tamara and I had. The incredible synchronicity when a Catholic priest by the name of Marsilio Ficino,
Mm.
who had gotten his hands on the manuscripts of works by Plato and Plotinus and Aristotle, and we think obviously the Orphic hymns, so we don't know where he got them from, and and with those he wanted to devote his life to translating them, because they had been lost during the Dark Ages for generations.
Mm.
So he was very frustrated and didn't know where to turn. So he decided to sing a hymn that he called the hymn to the cosmos.
Hmm.
And when he did, I mean, really soon after, he got a message, a letter from Cosmo de'
Right.
Medici,
Yeah.
who told him, I have decided to give you a house and a village to support the house, a farm and such, because I want you to devote your life to translating Plato
Wow.
and the rest of this stuff. And he says, we're already waiting for you here at the house. Please bring the translations because we're eager to learn how to live a good life. And
Right.
bring your lyre and sing to us. And
Mm.
that singing was definitely the hymns of Orpheus, because what eventually happened was this really became the Renaissance,
Hmm.
because the
Hmm.
Platonic Academy of Florence came from this. Ficino was famous for singing the hymns to his friends and working them up into these inspired states. So Poliziano wrote about in his journal, I listened to him singing the hymns, and I felt the divine energy surging in me. And I went home and I composed music all night. And he wound up doing an opera called Orpheus that was uh, stage designed by Leonardo da Vinci.
Oh my goodness.
And Pico della Mirandola was a great friend of Ficino's and was highly inspired by all of this. So, so many people, I mean, really all the leading lights of the early Renaissance were from Ficino. And then Agrippa comes along, and he's also pulling a lot of material out of Ficino. And both of these two giants in Western esotericism, I mean, just towering, they have these wonderful quotes that were one of the reasons that Tamara and I got really into doing these hymns, because Ficino had said that there's no magic more powerful than the Orphic hymns.
Yes.
But what I really like from him is this quote where he said, I learned from Orpheus that love existed and that it held the keys to the whole world.
Mm.
The whole power of magic consists in love. The work of magic is the attraction of one thing by another because of a certain affinity of nature.
Mm.
And then along comes Agrippa, and in his book, Three Books of Occult Philosophy, the most plagiarized book in Western esotericism, he says, listen, if you're interested in this stuff, you should research the Orphic hymns, because if you do them with the right circumstances and at the right time with the appropriate harmony, and your focus is complete, they are the most effective natural magic.
Yeah.
So what did they mean, right? That's the big question now. Were they bending the world to their will? Were they manifesting what they wanted through these hymns and such? I don't think so. I think the reason that they're the most powerful is because they do tune us to the divine. And this is what he means, I think, Ficino, by they taught me about love, is it taught him that the world isn't an irrational place of chaos and destruction and murder. It's actually filled with beauty and mercy and cooperation and inspiration, and that the love of the divine, of the divinities for all of us, is obvious in nature if we only pause to respect nature and to harmonize with it and to harmonize with the gods.
So if I may be so bold as to paraphrase or try to get inside Ficino's head for a minute,
Sure.
from that we can say, okay, because it's tempting to say, oh, Ficino sang the hymn and then he got this letter, so Ronnie, he manifested that. Well, I mean, yes and no. I think Ficino would say, I harmonized with the thing that I desired to become one with, and that harmonizing manifested the thing that I needed in order to do what I wanted to do. So,
I would say definitely, and I would add to that, that in aligning with the gods. So rather than saying, I want this, you're saying, I want what the God wants.
yes.
So apparently Ficino was trying to do something that the gods willed.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah.
They were already working on it.
Yeah. And that answers the question of like anybody who's done any kind of magic, like why do certain things seem to work, and others not? Well, because you're finding out the answer to your prayer is, no, we're not interested. Sorry. Or yes, son, let's go, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, wild, man. That's really
Yeah.
wild stuff. Thank you for sharing all that. Yeah, one thing I wanted to add that I think is really interesting is that Agrippa, the quote you had from Agrippa, that part comes after he's telling them, I think, hey, you can sort of compose your own hymns essentially by studying all the correspondences and
Yeah.
studying what these gods do and especially what they don't like,
Hmm.
and you can appeal to all of that. And if you need any help in this, by the way, the Orphic thing is like a really good example, right?
Yeah, which is
Yeah,
exciting. I think that's so brilliant that he did that. He recognized that, and that he
yeah,
basically gave birth to uh, God knows how many practitioners who invented their own approaches with his permission.
right, yeah, exactly. Right, yeah, yeah, because that was one of the first questions that I was going to have for you, is that hey, because like back in the day, right, to monkey with this stuff was thought to be a sin and basically a heresy.
Yeah. Yeah, we
um
always describe ourselves. Tamara and I describe ourselves as blasphemers. We committed the sin of onomacritus, right? And he
yes.
was punished for it, by interpolating our own stuff into the hymns. But it also happened in a funny way, because in our initial approach, I would say it was more literary. Like we were certainly sincere in singing them and such, but we intended it as a kind of an artistic ritual. And then
Hmm.
when we got these responses and we realized that there was this magic was happening,
Hmm.
we felt very humbled and respectful, and we kind of felt like, oh wow, we didn't mean to disturb you.
Yeah, right.
We love this, but and so that kind of changed our feelings about it. But then as we did this latest version that got published, we really thought this needs to happen. I mean, the Athanasicus translation is wonderful, very accurate. He minimized repetition, provides wonderful support materials, but he's still limited by the reality of what's in there and how dry it is.
Hmm.
And I recommend to everyone, by the way, to buy all the translations. There's only, I think, 5 or 6 right now. I think so, and compare them, because I
Right.
think that through looking at the English through all these different translations, you get a much richer experience.
Yeah.
But ours is as far as I know, the first to build those cult correspondences into the hymns themselves, so that you can immerse yourself in that experience while you're performing them. And
Nice.
also, I had the advantage. I mean, Tamara is a really wonderful lyricist, and so the musicality of the poetry was another thing we were looking for. That we wanted it to sing easily, and if you were just reading it, that it should have an entrancing value. And what we
Mhm.
sought was that experience when, and I think most of the hymns accomplish this, when you read them, there's like this beat of silence when you're done.
Mm.
They have this kind of after effect, and I've experienced this even when people have read them. I had one podcaster read one of the hymns, and then afterwards said, "Whoa, I really don't want to say anything now." They have that kind of feeling. So that's what we were trying to accomplish. We felt that that kind of a respectful approach, it was to bring people closer to the gods, would be all right at this point in our history where we need all the help we can get.
Yeah, because one of the first things that I did, is the hymn to Mercury, the hymn to Hermes. Being a hermetic guy, I rewrote it for myself because, as an act of devotion, you know
Exactly.
and then
Exactly.
but then I realized afterwards, like, wait, am I actually allowed to do that? So,
I
and
think
I
that
thought, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think that question comes from the hierarchies that were behind a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
So I think the reason that everybody was so concerned about onomacritus getting in there and interpolating things had less to do with the sacredness of it and more to do with the inviolability of the priest caste. And
Yes.
there's a lot of power associated there. And
Right.
we have a freedom now that I don't think was really available then.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, great point. Well, I do have some questions for you.
Sure.
So let me see. So as far as the myth, the actual myth of Orpheus,
Mm-hmm.
um, I'm interested, on page 5, you mentioned the 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 Argo, right? Orpheus was an Argonaut. He was one of the heroes that went with Jason on this great
Mm-hmm.
uh, adventure. And I love the way you call Argo the first tour bus in Western history. As a kid who grew up in the late 80s and came of age in the late 80s, when like there were always hippies going to a Dead show somewhere, I can really appreciate that, man. um and
Well, I
then
think if I may come in here for a
yeah.
second, I really think that Orpheus is such the rock star archetype. Here
Hmm.
you have a guy who talk about counterculture, man. I
Right.
mean, here you have the Olympian Greek culture, right, where they're worshiping the Homeric point of view, the warriors. They're worshiping these deities who appreciate blood sacrifices, and it's all about the power of men and service to the polis, to the city, and and then along comes this. I mean, the religion of Dionysus, bad enough, right? I mean,
Yeah.
so irrational with the gender bending and the completely different approach and empowering women by giving them the right to go off into the woods and practice in privacy whatever rites they want to do. And that was enough to deal with. You see Euripides wrestling with this in his wonderful tragedy about Dionysus and Pentheus, but then you get Orpheus, who steps into the Dionysian religion, and probably I kind of go along with Bertrand Russell and Burkert and a lot of other scholars. It does seem like the Orphic thing is the Pythagoreans stepping in and civilizing Dionysian religion,
Yes.
and so they come in and they say, oh, no blood sacrifice. I mean, what, Apollo doesn't want blood and guts.
Right.
This is ridiculous. They want harmony, they want flowers, they want honey and milk and wine, they want your noble deeds and your
Mm.
hospitality to strangers, and
Yeah.
that's how we sacrifice. No more, because you know what, somebody that you loved in your past life may be in that animal that you're killing. You
Right.
don't know.
Right.
And also, why do you want to eat bodies? You have a body. It's already blocking your ability to recognize that you're a divine spirit.
Mm.
It's of the Titan. You throw more bodies in there. Now you're a cannibal. You're just like the Titan is eating
Yeah,
Zagreus,
right.
baby
That's very
Dionysus,
that's
right?
very interesting to me because there was a point, in fact, where you mentioned, let me find in my notes here. I had a question exactly about that part.
Okay.
Um, yeah, let's see. Okay, yeah. It's on page 44 where you're talking about the death at the hands of frenzied women. Let me just get to the page 44 so I can
Sure.
read directly from it. Yeah. Make sure I've got this right. Oh, yes. With the death of Orpheus at the hands of frenzied women, the Orphic myth draws a clear line of demarcation between past and future, right? And then you go on to explain what you just said. So a new, more civilized vision of the mysteries of Dionysus was born, right? And so my thinking there was that basically, like, Orphism is essentially, or the Orphic is the Dionysian realloyed with the Apollonian, right? So
Mhm.
right where so yeah, because you're saying we don't want to double down on the Titan part. We want to bring in more of the Apollonian. And so yeah, so that pretty much answers my question because I had this thought at the time. Okay, so we're basically like watering down the Titan version, and bringing in more of Apollo to
Well, Apollo being said to be the savior of Dionysus, right?
right,
Apollo,
right.
it goes and gathers all the fragments of Dionysus, and then it and rebirths him into this this divine grandeur.
Mm,
And so you can even wonder about Apollo, not many, but in terms of Greek, that he's unifying, he's taking the many and he's
yes,
making them into the one.
yes.
And so I think that there's so many beautiful metaphors in all of this mythology.
Mm,
The not only do you get, let's go back to the rock star idea, right? So
yes.
so he's a now not only does he do that, and he says, I'm a vegetarian, no more sacrifice. He's a musician. He's a musician who sings songs that everybody says have the truth of the universe in them.
Mm,
And whatever he does, everything stops when he sings. Everybody just stops and listens.
mm,
He is somebody who, everywhere he travels, he establishes a new mystery school. He
mm,
creates songs for the gods of that place when he's on the Argo and they stop different places.
mm,
He is able to outsing the draw of the Song of the Sirens. So even they can't overcome his music. And then eventually he goes into Hades with his music, and he does manage to strike a deal to bring back Eurydice, although famously he fails.
mm.
So his music, a very Apollonian quality, and remember, Orpheus is said after Eurydice's death to dwell on a mountaintop where he
Singing
sings to
song.
Apollo at dawn
Apollo.
every morning,
Yep.
and Apollo is said to teach him the mysteries. So the this is such a different approach to how to live, and then the reaction to it also reminded me of rock stars, because you have the crazy females running after trying to rip him apart, and you've
Beatlemania,
got,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
Beatlemania, and you've got you have the authority figures who they say that he's, oh, you know what, he's effeminate. There was
Right.
even a story that Ovid told. He said, well, he sang this song about a red lit boy that made Greece gay. This is the kind of accusations that people would throw at rock stars back
Right.
in the day.
Right.
And then they would laugh at him for being a coward because he wouldn't compete with the other sacred singers, because he thought that that was a violation of the sacredness of singing these songs. There shouldn't be any competition. So that
Mm,
they were like, look at him, he doesn't even compete.
mhm.
And worst of all, he was a peacenik. He
Right.
didn't want to train for war. He didn't think you should kill.
Worst of all.
Well, for them, right?
No
So
blood
because
sacrifice, no war. What the
what are we
hell?
gonna do? So this is to me, when it just seemed like, wow, that's Western counterculture. That's where it starts, right there with this mythology.
Hmm.
And on it rolls, by the way, as the book shows, to not just inspire the Renaissance, but in the troubadour period, he was reinvented as Sir Orfeo and was an example to all troubadours. A little bit later on, he was compared to King David and became Sir Orpheus, who was this great warrior, ironically.
Wow.
And on it went, and on and on. I mean, it's amazing. Even in the 60s, there was a band called Orpheus that was a big ripoff of the Doors, and there was, of course, Morrison himself was deeply into Dionysus. And I've met a number of young occultists who have gotten into the whole Dionysus side of things because they were Jim Morrison fans.
Right. Right. Yeah. 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 Morrison kind of went the other way almost, though, where he kind of yeah, he went a little far, I think most people would say, with the whole Dionysian thing. And so that idea of like of you know alloying the Dionysian with the Apollonian as a
Mhm.
protective, as a way of civilizing the Dionysian, but also to me as a protective measure of retaining one's sanity,
Mhm. Mhm.
because I
Mhm.
mean, the other question that I had is that on that same page, let's see, no, it's a little bit different place. We there you were talking about let's see. So I want to go with the counterculture there for a second. You were talking about let's see. So Ficino, I think, is saying that Apollo is air and fire, and Dionysus is earth and water, for they are inseparable companions. Um, this is in chapter 8 of the Renaissance. It's either Ficino or Pico. I'm
Yeah.
not sure who exactly you're referring to there. Um, you said the person who renewed the academy. So I'm
Yeah.
guessing
It's Ficino.
that's Ficino, right?
Yeah.
Um, so if Apollo is air and fire and Dionysus is earth and water, right? The upward tending elements, right, versus the downward tending elements. Do you think it's helpful if we think of it like the conscious and the unconscious, like, because if Dionysus is basically
Interesting.
a way to contact the unconscious,
Hmm.
then you know alloying that with the Apollonian is very much a good idea, because too direct a contact or too overwhelming a contact with the unconscious leads to madness,
Hmm.
essentially, right?
Yeah. I had an interesting conversation, which ties this in with what we're talking about with Jim Morrison, which is Patricia Keneally Morrison, his
Hmm.
pagan bride,
Yes.
was somebody who followed my astrology, and we became friends, and we had conversations, actually even going back before my astrology, when I was touring, because I had a mutual friend with her, and they said, you really should meet her. And we were already alert to the hymns of Orpheus and such, and working on them at that time, Tamara and I. And I told Patricia about it. I said, well, we're working on the hymns of Orpheus, and she thought that was great. And we discussed uh, Jim Morrison and the influence of Dionysus. And her perspective was very interesting, because she said that the Jim Morrison that she knew was very much um, more Apollo, and that he was a polite, super intelligent, um, loved to create poetry and music,
Mhm.
and she said that the other side of him was something that was amplified by Pam and by fans and psychophants and business people who wanted Jim Morrison to be the crazy, out of control sex maniac,
Right.
because that sold more records.
Of course.
And so she said that she thought that he had been torn apart by the Maenads.
Right. Right. And so there is a question there, like, what can we learn from that, the literal image of Orpheus's death, that being torn apart? There's several things in the book that you talk about um, with respect to that. Um, let's see. Yeah. So one that in one page on page 7, you talk about the tearing apart symbolizes truth being broken into pieces, right? And it just reminded me of, like, the whole journey of you going through the historical account and the scholarship behind this stuff. And basically, like, it just reminded me, like, there's this experience of unity that is behind Orphism, right? But then the scholars break it into a million pieces, and nobody's even sure that this stuff ever existed as such, right? Because
Yeah.
there's like this literal, they tear it to pieces, right? Literally,
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
know
it's true. It's really, I mean, you can find arguments for and against almost anything in Orphism.
exactly.
And it's
It's
also
kind of
interesting.
maddening, it's frustrating, but at the same time,
Hmm.
it's kind of like the nature of reality, right? Because if you
Yeah.
know anything about occultism, the whole idea is that, there is the one, and then there's the many, right? And in the process of, or even just from a Pythagorean's point of view, there's one, and then there's two and three and four, and then there's the thousand things, as they say in the Tao or whatever. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
that's just reality, man.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, I think it's also I want to point out that was Blavatsky, by the way, who said that it represents truth being torn
Oh,
apart.
it was Blavatsky. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, the the thing about that myth is, first of all, it makes Orpheus into Dionysus, right?
Yeah.
Because Dionysus is torn apart by the Titans.
Right.
That's always fascinated me, that connection there, that Orpheus suffers the same fate.
Yeah.
And I kind of look at, we've been talking here about the idea of, if you go too deeply into the Dionysus side, you're risking madness.
Yes.
And of course, if you go too deeply into the Apollo side, you're risking madness,
Mm.
right? Because the extreme of, let's call it patriarchal rationalism,
Yeah.
or
Relativism, for instance, madness. It's madness. Like,
mhm,
well, there's no truth. There's no objective truth because everything's only true from some subjective point of view. Like, that is a kind of madness, right?
exactly, the
Absolutely. Yeah.
extreme. And also the an illustration, another illustration of the madness of it is in the use of words. So I often get asked about this, and of course there are raging arguments about this going on all over the world of metaphysics, which is, what are we addressing when we address these hymns?
Hmm.
So if you're coming from a Christian point of view, you might argue that, well, those must be demons that are impersonating these pagan gods.
Right.
If you're coming from the point of view of Jung, they're archetypes, and they represent certain aspects of human
Yeah.
behavior that are repeated so often that we all have recognized, and they turn into these symbols. If
Hmm.
you're talking to certain occultists, they're going to tell you that it's an egregore,
Yes.
and that this is this, if they don't know what that is, it's a collective thought form that takes on a life of its own and manipulates people in order to survive and increase its power.
Hmm.
And there's other people who would say, well, it's, with Robert Anton Wilson, that it's a reality tunnel. There are
Hmm.
people who argue that the gods are aliens. So, what are we addressing now? What is that? You get lost in that stuff,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
For sure.
it's words being mistaken for things.
Yes.
It's mistaking the designator for the thing it designates. And we have to understand that there may be some smidgen of truth in all those definitions, but they are all very inadequate to describing whatever it is that's behind those definitions.
Yes.
And so people are so profoundly uncomfortable with suspense and with not knowing. And to me, the sacred space, if you're going to approach these areas of life, whether it's indigenous or it's Neoplatonic, it's Orphic, you're going to want to keep an open mind, an openness to paradoxes, and an ability to both, for instance, like Tamara and I, when we have those experiences, to both say, that's impossible, what just happened, and
Yeah.
to also feel profound reverence and appreciation for this mystery that just unfolded, that
Hmm.
shows us that something is going on,
Hmm.
and we're privileged to live our lives further exploring that.
Right. Yeah, and I just wanted to, for one more point of view to throw
Sure.
out there that there were amongst the occultists, particularly, there were those who were Christian who didn't see these things as demons, but saw them as just various aspects of the one, of God.
Yeah.
And so they
Yeah.
they saw no problem with being Christians and also honoring these pagan gods. And honestly, if for me, it's like it's pretty simple. If I read the book, the Bible, as
Mm-hmm.
Luther did, that is, if I read it for myself
Mm-hmm.
and I see, God says literally, have no other gods before me. So he's telling you there are other gods, right?
Yeah.
Just don't put them before me. Like, don't put the many
Exactly.
before the one, essentially.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Yeah, and
So
Pico actually has a great quote about that,
right.
where
Yeah, yeah.
he says that these names of the gods that Orpheus is singing to are not deceiving demons. Evil doesn't come from them; good comes from them, and
Yes.
that's because they're natural divine powers that the true God distributed in the world to help us, if we can be humble enough to learn how to use them.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. So, wow, man, this is great. I'm really enjoying this. Let's see. So we talked about the death. I wanted to talk a little bit more about this idea that you talked about the hymns as on the back cover of the book. You talk about them as a book of hours or a calendar of life, and you spoke about that a little bit earlier. Um, Even on page 36, you said that some scholars think of them as that the order is done in a way to facilitate like this drunken all-nighter. So
Right.
there's something about the order that is cyclical or sacred or holy in and of itself, like the ordering of them. And I
It's
wonder if you could,
interesting.
it
There's
sounds like,
arguments about that, like
yeah,
everything else, and
right,
some of them say that well, it's random. I mean, this is how it came down to us pretty much, and it was in this order, but we don't know that this was actually an arranged order.
right,
But there is more recent scholarship that I found fascinating, about the possibility that these hymns, as we have them now, were written down during the period of the four Julias in
yes.
ancient Rome, which was an extraordinary cultural period. I mean, it
Severan
was,
dynasty, yeah.
yeah, the Severan dynasty. It was an absolutely terrible time in a way for Rome. There was this period where Roman emperors were being killed one after the other. I mean, some of them only reigned for a month, and Severus was a general and
Right.
loved by his troops, and he was only half Italian. He was half Carthaginian,
Hmm.
and he
Which means
became
African.
emperor.
He was black. Yeah.
Yeah. And he became emperor. And this was a scandal in Rome because he was, they, considered this a kinsman of the worst enemy Rome ever had, Hannibal.
Mm.
And yet he and his wife, Julia Domna, which means Black Julia, she was a Syrian priestess of Baal. And apparently he wed her because an astrologer said that whoever wed her would rule the world. and and yeah, and together they had an
Because her
understanding.
chart said that she would marry the guy who would rule, right? So the
Yes,
astrologer, so he
exactly.
was like, well, shoot, that I'd like to be that guy.
Me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then what happened was, they loved Rome because they to them it worked, right? It's like they were saying, wow, okay, so if I, as somebody who's Carthaginian, I'm an African, can become emperor, and my Syrian priestess of Baal wife can become empress, then these ideas, this Roman ideal works, that we
And in
can bring.
fact, Severus did in the extraordinary measure of saying anyone who is, um,
Paying
he
taxes.
yeah, he extended citizenship to
Yeah,
in the same way to kind of extend the personal um, freedom that you're explaining. He
yeah,
extended that to a lot of people. In
he
fact, yeah,
did. Yeah,
yeah,
another scandal because he
right,
changed the definition of being a Roman citizen.
right, right,
And now it was, if you paid taxes to Rome, you're a Roman citizen, no matter where you live. And that the
right.
Romans were scandalized. So now Julia Domna, he was busy fighting wars all the time. He was an excellent general. But Julia Domna, she started this incredible, really a cultural renaissance because at her court, her what we would now call salons included Galen, who was a medical authority for 1,000 years and revolutionized medicine in those days. That included the Philostratus, the author of the Life of Apollonius of Tyana. It included Apuleius, who wrote the Golden Ass or the Metamorphosis, really the first kind of satirical novel, but also a document about the mysteries. And it included some real geniuses in jurisprudence, which apparently Julia Domna herself was, and they revolutionized Roman law to such a degree that it is still the foundation of the law in Europe and what used to be the European colonies.
Mm.
So this was a kind of renaissance that occurred here, and
Hmm.
it seems very likely that the hymns were performed then. So the scholars who argue that point of view, they think that it is in a specific order because they think that all these people that we just described would get together with Julia Domna and they would drink all night and they would do these hymns. And
Wow.
so the hymns that celebrate the fertility of life, right? The ecstasies of life tend to be more in the middle section
Mm-hmm.
and kind of culminate about 2/3 through. And that seems to be, now we're getting, the drink is hitting us, and but they end with the somber kind of myths, and I mean
Yes.
hymns, especially the one to death, which ends the whole thing. So the
Right.
idea is, according to this scholar, that they were sobering you up at the end, right?
Right. Right. Time,
And
time to
okay, we're
hit the
almost,
road, get sober
exactly,
before we drive home, right?
exactly, closing time.
Wow. That's intense, man. Yeah. Um, oh, wow. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, we've been at this almost an hour. So, um, let's see, is there anything you want to talk about that I haven't asked you yet?
Let me think for a moment what I'd like to share with your listeners about these things. I think that what, to me, one of the things I love about them is they remind me of the indigenous approach to nature and to life.
Hmm.
We have the indigenous ritual where we give respect, we give tobacco to the four directions.
Hmm.
We see in ceremonial magic a similar approach in the creation of the protective circle and using the sword to the directions kind of thing. Um, I was talking to somebody actually very recently who was going through some really bad experiences that were triggered by experiences with ceremonial magicians and ritual,
Mm.
and trying to, and I think successfully redirecting them toward a more indigenous approach to ritual. Because one of the things that I've found, and this might be useful for people, is, and I found this way back because I wasn't only Manly Hall's research assistant, I was also his screener. And that was a very intense experience to meet the people who wanted to meet Manly Hall.
I
And he
bet.
got a lot of really, messed up people who
Yeah.
saw him as the last resort.
Mm.
And in many cases, he didn't want to meet with them, but he would tell me what to say to
Uh-huh.
them.
Wow.
And so I did see a lot of people mostly involved in either spiritualism or in ceremonial magic, especially the left hand path stuff, who
Right.
got themselves into trouble. And one of the things I often saw was people would, like, they would do this ritual, and they would do it so carefully, and then they would realize after the ritual was over that they'd screwed up something, and so they hadn't quite written the sigil right or something, and then they would panic
Yeah.
because then some kind of malevolent entities were going to enter their lives, and now what were they going to do? They didn't exactly know what to do from that point.
Right.
And in an indigenous ritual isn't like that. Indigenous ritual doesn't populate the air with malevolent entities who are waiting for us to make a mistake.
Right.
You're just coming from your heart,
Yes.
and you're saying thank you for life, thank you for the
Yes.
gifts of love and food and children and all the great things that make life worth living.
Right.
And that, I think that the hymn should be approached that way. Although I tell people, please use them however you see fit, and like I said, let us know if anything interesting happens.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the so I think that the these hymns have a wholesomeness, a healing quality,
Mm.
and an inspirational quality to
Hmm.
them that sets them apart. And I think that's what Ficino meant by that, they taught him about love.
Mm.
And it reminds me of the idea that when we approach how we live life, what we project out there comes back to us. So if you believe that this is a jungle and you're out there competing and you have no mercy for people, that's the world you're going to live in.
Hmm.
And I think one of the things that really moved me the most about Manly Hall, when I first encountered his book, it was an early edition of the Secret Teachings that I found at the late lamented Bodhi Tree bookstore, and it was dedicated to the rational soul of the world,
Mm.
which I was this, like, at that point in my life, I was this nihilistic criminal, basically. And I, just reading that was, what? At first I was just, that's ridiculous, but then as I read the book and I understood why he was saying that, it changed my whole view of life.
Mm,
And I have spent my life assuming that nature and the world are here to teach me not to just mindlessly destroy everything.
mm,
That's an aspect of it.
mm-hmm,
And that brings us to, maybe this is a good thing to finish up on. Let's go
mm-hmm.
back to this question of Apollo and Dionysus, that there's
Yes.
madness on either end of either extreme, right?
Yes.
So they're corrective to each other. That's what makes them such a great pairing. The
Mm-hmm.
way that earth and water is corrective to fire and air, and
Yeah.
vice versa.
Yes.
So when you've got too much of that patriarchal reason, and everything kind of becomes arid and dried out, and the
Yeah.
female side of life, and the gender blurred side of life, and the all the things that broke loose in the 1960s, they are suppressed, and life becomes this terrible task. And you even get religions that tell you, well, you're probably not going to be saved even if you live exactly according to the law, because you are the seed of Adam and Eve, and
Yeah.
why should God save you? That kind of that to me is the far extreme of the patriarchal reason point of view. So if Apollo goes too far, it's like the sun burns everything up,
Mm,
and we're parched.
mm-hmm.
But then you apply Dionysus. So Dionysus showed up in Greek society and messed everything up. And Euripides has this great story where, for your readers who may not be familiar with the Bacchae, that it's Pentheus is this macho king who runs Thebes, and with an iron fist, and along comes Dionysus, who's this wanderer with his fellow, I mean, it really is like a bunch of Grateful Dead followers or something. And they come into the city, and he doesn't like the look of him, and he has him imprisoned immediately. It's just as you would in 1966 if you saw hippie vagrants come into town.
Yeah, right.
And he says, Dionysus says to Pentheus, oh, this is a big mistake. The god won't stand for this. And sure enough, there's an earthquake that knocks down the jail, and the chains fall off of Dionysus, and he just walks out of jail.
Nice.
And at this point, Pentheus is already overtaken by divine madness. And he says, instead of coming up and saying, you really are, you're Dionysus, or you serve Dionysus, who are you? No, he says, so what are those women doing up there? And Dionysus says, well, I know a way you can find out, but you'll have to dress up like one of them. And so the macho guy dresses up, and then he winds up going, gee, do I look good in this dress? Or does this make me look fat, basically? And the feminine side starts to erupt. And this all ends tragically when his own mother doesn't recognize him. She thinks he's an animal, and
Mm,
rips his head off in the fury of the god, and comes back to town carrying this head, like, look, thinking that she's done something magnificent. And then the god takes away the madness, and she sees what she's done, and Thebes is plunged into horror and tragedy. And the
mm,
message from the god, who then reveals himself in his glory, is, you got to pay attention to me too. The
mm-hmm.
irrational side of life, the female side of life. I'm
Right.
not equating those things, but
Unconscious, whatever. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, the non-patriarchal reason side of life
Mm-hmm.
also is very important to human beings,
Mm,
and needs to be allowed to have its expression. So when that becomes too strong, then Apollo comes in, and begins to lift it into a more civilized place. When Apollo becomes too strong, then Dionysus comes in and says, whoa, 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 wait a minute. We need some wine. We need some song. We need to relax, and
right.
forget all this mental stuff, right?
Nice. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, that I love it, man. Yeah, that's pretty much the feeling that I was getting from a lot of this. So thank you for that confirmation, and thank you for a wonderful conversation. And
Oh,
thank you
anytime.
again for a wonderful book.
Thank you.
Once again, it's The Magic of the Orphic Hymns, Inner Traditions. It's a new translation by Ronnie Pontiac and Tamara Lucid. And people can find you on Instagram at the Ronnie Pontiac.
Yes.
And otherwise, if they want to find out more about you, just Google Ronnie Pontiac and you're all over the place.
Yeah, I think you can grab my link tree off of the Instagram, but
Yeah,
there's films and
excellent.
there's music and there's all kinds of stuff. So there's not really a website. It's just spread all over.
Right on. Okay. Thank you so much, Ronnie. Appreciate
Oh,
you.
thank you. I really enjoyed it. I hope to have another conversation with you.
Sounds good.
Cool,
Okay.
man.
Till then,
Bye. Have a great week.
blessings. Peace.
You too. Bye.